Okay, hello, welcome in. This is the Magic the Gathering unofficial audiobooks podcast. I am Phil Dawson. Yes, long time, no talk. But I'm so happy that you're all here riding along as we start up the final book of the Masquerade cycle, Prophecy, the third book. And I have to say, I really loved Nemesis, the last book. Thought it was really great exposition into the happenings on Wrath. I thought the character exposés on almost everyone in it was so good, and knowing that we'll see more of those characters has me really excited. Now, where we're heading, and this is all happening at the same time. So, our first book was what was going on with the Weatherlight crew as they were trapped on Mercadia. Then we saw what was happening on Wrath as that was going on. And this one, which we are starting, is giving us a glimpse of what is happening on Dominaria. Again, without reading this book yet, I'm not sure what we're going to see, but we're given a clue on the back of this book about Jamuraa, where Teferi is from. So we'll see him, I suppose. The Keldons, the warish, brutish race that was featured back in the Bloodlines novel. You may remember Gatha, who abandoned the Talarian Academy, went to Keld, started experimenting on the Keldons, where we met Craig the Immortal, the Witch King. But a group of Dominarians are quite different from the others on that plane. So we're going to see what's happening with all of that here. I'm looking forward to see who we do run into. And again, this is all happening on the precipice of the Phyrexian invasion. So we will see. This is exciting stuff. Other than that, while it is a ways away after this book, we are planning on going back to read the Thran after this. Then we'll re-pick up with the invasion cycle. So that's kind of the update of the plan of books, the order that we're going in. We're going to jump back in time, pre-everything, to the Thran and learn a little bit more about Yawgmoth. So that's the update there. Personally, too, we are approaching the new year. Do it every year, reevaluate goals, what we're trying to do with this little thing that we got going on. And I'm so very thankful for all of your support. The last 6 or 7 months have been very intense for me personally and professionally with the baby, the business, brewing, trying to balance all of this. And I'm really just trying to hang on and keep going. And I think we're closing in on hitting a stride here. So I'm confident that we will get there. And if nothing else, no, I'm just going to keep trying to pump out the chapters when I get a chance. I also have to thank all my Patreon supporters. Again, this is not possible without you. I am firmly dedicated to this because of all of you. It means so much, not just to me, but to my family, my dog, who the support has been going to this last couple of months. That's been brutally hard. He's in a good place, but I miss that little guy dearly. Even though I've been blessed with even more cuteness and love in the home, he is my first best boy, my first good boy, right? So I get misty sometimes thinking about him. Anyway, all of your support I'm very grateful for, and I do hope to repay you all with not only the chapters, but once we find that groove, we can get you some gear and stuff that hopefully makes you know that I really do appreciate you all and that there's value to supporting me even more so than just this chapters and reading these books together, even though that's fun. For those that are looking to support a creator, I will happily put my name in the mix. The 40 or other Patreons can't be wrong, right? And I can use all the support you can give. Anything is fine. I even opened a tip drawer if you don't want to subscribe. But becoming a patron is the best way to support. You can find more information by going to patreon.com/mtgbooks or just look me up, patreon.com, Phil Dawson. That's where you can do it. Hey, and businesses out there, what the heck? Why not? Support the show. Become a title sponsor. We haven't had one in a while. Come on. Let's do it. Let's do it together. Also, if you can share, like, all that kind of stuff. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. I don't know, that's opened up. It's just the RSS feed of the podcast, but it takes 1 second. The more subscribers there, I can turn into more support too, so that'd be helpful. Feel free to write reviews wherever you can. Maybe on Reddit too. You can start those Reddit threads. Join the Discord. You can chat there. That's a lot of fun. And what else? Write me directly. I love hearing from you all. And if you showed up in our Spotify Wrapped, let me know. If you didn't know, we'd been on a 3-year run of perfect 5-star ratings. Well, Wrapped told me this year, drum roll, 4.9. So that's bullshit. I'm just kidding. We are nearly perfect, and that was really cool. I was a top 10 show for over 2,000 Spotify listeners and the number one show for 607 people. Thank you so much, all of you. All right. Thanks again. Who's ready to go to Dominaria? Let's do this. Magic the Gathering, Prophecy, Masquerade Cycle, Book 3. Vance Moore. Chapter 1. Where in the nine hells is everyone? Haddad muttered as the small group of men and wagons tramped through the night. We lost again? His feet disturbed a mound of stones collected at the bottom of a crumbling hillside. The land seemed dead. Successive seasons of cold and heat had shattered rock and piled scree everywhere. The road was deep, cut wide, but the rock faces sloughed debris every day and covered the road or ate at its base. It was too cold for insects, and the column of the marching men cut sharp shadows in the moonlight. Within hours, the sun would rise and sear everything. It was a land of no good seasons. Quiet, Haddad, Natal murmured. I'm sure the sergeant knows where he's going. Natal stamped his feet to warm them in the night air. Anyway, the last thing he wants to hear is you. Both men were soldiers in the Jamuraan League of Annies. The league had been named after Lord Kipamu, a legendary figure who is credited with many important military victories, the old-time frontiers of Jamuraa. Dead for centuries, if not millennia, the Lord's name still commanded respect all over the continent. Haddad nodded and shivered as he hugged his coat more tightly. He was wearing most of the clothing he owned. Haddad tried to tuck his hands into his sleeves, but flailed his arms for balance on the uncertain footing. The noise of others stumbling over rock was overpowered by the sound of wagon wheels crunching and sliding over a broken roadway. Sergeant Atul signaled a halt, and Haddad relayed the order down the line. The chill breeze heralding the dawn cut through the men. None of the soldiers spoke, though chattering teeth sounded. Many moved closer to the wagons, holding their hands against the warm sides of the oxen. Natal edged closer to the animals, and Haddad shifted to give his comrade room. The friends were several yards away from Sergeant Atul as he conferred with the more experienced soldiers. False dawn began to reveal itself of the landscape. I wonder if they know where we are, Haddad questioned again. The sergeant's ears were sharper than anyone had expected. You two, quiet down. Check the oxen and wagons, now. Sergeant Atul spoke with no perceptible malice, but the pair instantly started inspecting the condition of the draft beasts in the wagons. Haddad and Natal split and went down opposite sides of the line, checking the cargo and the beasts. They peered uncertainly into the dim light, hoping no problems would be found. The sergeant continued to converse with the other veteran soldiers. Bad luck and poor communications had delayed the unit's departure far longer than anyone planned. Unsure of the road, the technical unit had set out into the wilderness. The combat troops were far ahead, and most of the unit wondered if they could find them. The Kipamu League's punitive strike had left at its best speed in response to rumors of a Keldon raiding party. The barbarians were supposedly encamped only miles away, resting their beasts before returning to their base across the desolate plain. The Keldons were warriors and slave-takers. They had swept over the world in ages past, though it had been decades since any League city had suffered a serious attack. Now the Keldons were once again raiding Jamuraa, and the League was eager to test its strength. Friendly forces had failed to catch the raiders during the past 3 incursions. The lack of success against raiders was a source of embarrassment to the army and League leaders. Some civilians said the army was scared to attack figures from childhood nightmares. The news that a target might still be within striking distance of the Kipamu barrack provoked an immediate response. A force of war machines and mounted infantry was dispatched. The mechanical forces were steel ants, the weakest and most common element in the Kipamu arsenal. However, the high speed of the waist-high metal insectoids made them the quickest force the army could field. Besides, the commanders said the low quality of their foes presented no real challenge to the League, just Keldon trash raiding small farms. Haddad wondered if bravado ruled the army now. Seeking to crush their own fears, the combat troops had raced out into the field. The need for speed left the support troops exposed and without escorts they followed, chivying their plodding oxen into the cold darkness. The support troopers carried supplies and maintenance equipment, but as non-combat troops they had none of the rashness burning in the commanders who raced to fight. The veterans looked for machines or cavalry for protection, but they found none. Sergeant O'Toole had said if he had a choice between shivering naked with a proper column of security or maintaining the current situation, he'd risk frostbite. "Natal!" O'Toole called. "Come here." Haddad followed his friend forward as the sergeant set two veterans to the rear of the column. Haddad noticed each of them looked more calm and ready than he felt. Perhaps it was only his youth making him so nervous. Things couldn't be as bad as he feared. Haddad slung his launcher off of his shoulder where he usually carried it. The sling was too short to quickly shrug off, and whenever he was nervous, he carried it ready to fire. The sergeant looked at the friends but did not comment on Haddad trailing along. There were several other men gathered around looking like they were awaiting orders. "Natal, you and Corporal Vanash will advance ahead of the group until you find the combat troops or some sign of the enemy. If you catch the rear guard, ask for a security detail to return with you. If you find the enemy, fall back here. Natal, you're on point. Advance rapidly but with care. Vanash, trail Natal at a distance, and if necessary, fall back with news." The sergeant looked into Natal's face and looked satisfied at the young man's expression of determination and anxiety. "Just remember that returning with information is more important than being a hero. What are you carrying?" O'Toole gestured to the launcher Natal was carrying. "Webraugen, Sergeant." Many men carried heavy weapons in addition to their military short swords, leaving their shields on the wagons. These wilderness lands were said to hold the paria, giant carnivorous birds that commonly attacked men. The birds were land-bound but swifter than horses, which they could chase down and dismember. The launcher Nadal carried had originally been developed to allow infantry to stand off lesser war machines. The web round would ensnare a steel ant and could stop a charging bird with ease, especially with the wide arc of web round covered. "Haddad, what are you carrying?" Sergeant Attal looked pensive and fingered the hilt of his sword unconsciously. "War rocket, Sergeant," Haddad replied. The rocket could cripple medium machines if used with skill and reflected Haddad's confidence in his marksmanship. "Switch with Natal." Haddad slowly handed his weapon and accepted Natal's. His friend looked even more apprehensive as he exchanged weapons. The sergeant waved Natal and the corporal forward, then turned around. O'Toole looked at the weapons stacked with parts for machines that might need repair after the Keldon raiders were defeated. "Haddad, I want you to find reloads for the men with launchers and tell the drivers to keep their personal weapons ready for dismount. We'll pull out in 5 minutes." The sergeant pulled a sack of wine from his belt, took a shallow draught before handing it to Haddad. The wine tasted terrible, but still cut through the cold dust coating Haddad's tongue. Natal and the corporal disappeared from sight as he handed back the wine. Haddad wondered what else might be lurking ahead. "Natal hasn't trained much with rockets, Sergeant." Fear and concern for his friend made him talkative. "Natal's purpose is to find the combat troops or warn us of the enemy. If he has to fire, he's most likely going to die. With the rocket, he'll at least die loudly and warn the rest of us," O'Toole said without looking at Haddad. "Find the reloads," he continued. "I'll speak to the drivers myself." Haddad turned numbly as he watched O'Toole speaking to the drivers. The wind was cold, but O'Toole's words were colder. Natal might die, and O'Toole only wanted it to be noisy. A few minutes' warning at best. Haddad started back to check the wagons as O'Toole instructed. He wondered what his own life was worth in the sergeant's estimation. The column advanced once again. Haddad went quickly from wagon to wagon, quizzing the drivers and searching the cargo for heavy weapon reloads. He found none. The machines making up the strike force were the lightest in the League arsenal. The commanders had not loaded the Ants' direct fire weapons. The League was still largely made up of mercenaries from the city wars ended only a few years back. Each city of the League had seen to its own defense and conducted small, stylized wars with other cities over resources, trade, or even honor. The wars depended heavily on paid mercenaries who fought according to a code of strictly limited warfare. Damaged machines and dead men were viewed as too costly. Heavy weapons were rarely used due to their fairly substantial costs, the damage they did to enemies who might be future allies, and the destruction of loot on the battlefield. Heavy weapons such as war rockets, toxic web rounds, and penetrating bolts were rarely used without desperation on the part of opposing forces. The current League commander did not consider a battle with the Keldon raiders as desperate. There were no reloads to be found in the wagons, just logistical supplies for infantry and modular repair parts for the steel lance. Natal and Corporal Vanish returned as Haddad looked through the last wagon. It had taken longer than he planned due to the poor light. The sun finished rising over the hillside as he hurried forward to report to the sergeant. He arrived in time to hear Corporal Vanish speak. "We've found the rear guard, Sergeant. It's about 40 minutes ahead with these oxen. The main attack has already commenced. The officer in charge said to advance with best speed to the main party. He was staying there to pull down stragglers fleeing from the fight. He couldn't guarantee we wouldn't see warriors that eluded him. We observed 3 Keldon outliers pulled down before we hurried back here." Vanash was calm as he spoke, but Natal was flushed and looked slightly nauseated. The sergeant was silent and only turned to Haddad for his report. "No reloads for personal launchers, Sergeant. I did find a few light crossbow bolts," Haddad stated. Sergeant Atul took only a few seconds to finish thinking. "All wagons will advance at maximum speed. Keep your eyes open for Keldons trying to escape. If a large group is spotted, be prepared to stop and get into fighting formation. Spread it down the line," Atul ordered, and he waved the unit forward as Vanash went back to spread the word. Haddad and Tal came together as the unit advanced at best speed. "What did you see?" Haddad asked quietly. "We walked maybe 30 minutes before we found the rear guard. Vanash trailed me far enough back that I couldn't see him most of the time. Besides, he ordered me not to look back. I almost wept with joy when we finally spotted our forces." Natal paused and continued in a more controlled tone. "Vanash hurried up and we reported. When the first Keldon got pulled down, I thought I'd vomit. I'd never seen a man killed by a steel ant before." Natal was too young to remember even the stylized fighting the League had practiced as unification occurred. "The Keldon was mounted on a camel and trying to circle around the force when he was spotted. The commander of the detachment sent out a pair of ants to stop him. They ran down the camel in seconds. The Keldon tried to run up the side of a hill, but it was unstable, and he made little headway." Natal became lost in remembrance of the scene and spoke more intently. "The ants rushed up with their legs churning out a steam of soil and small rocks. One of them pulled down the camel by shearing off a leg. The camel fell instantly, and the ant was at its neck as soon as it hit the ground. The Keldon kicked out of the saddle in time, and he was on his feet when the second ant hit him. He was trying to draw a sword, and you could see the ant take the arm off. He screamed and threw himself down the slope. The ant followed and caught him before he fell very far. It stabbed him with its legs and started dismembering him before they stopped sliding. You could see parts separating as they were ripped off. I never want to see anything like that again." Natal was shaking as he finished. "It looks like any future fighting is going to be against the Keldons, Natal. The age of machines fighting machines has ended. The enemy is men only now. More of the fighting is going to be men against men. The Keldons raid too widely. There are only so many machines." Haddad echoed the words of the pessimistic veterans. "You chose better than you knew when you went into the technical service. The infantry and cavalry are going to be fighting in the field, not sitting in garrison. When the real battles begin, we'll be in camp most of the time." His words were not those of a hero, but the early mercenary view of combat still was prevalent in the army. Combat was something you prepared for, but fighting was too dangerous and expensive to be eagerly sought. New recruits and new battles were changing the military, and Haddad knew he would be increasingly out of step with the mutable army. "Hey, Haddad!" Natal called, jarring his friend from his thoughts. "We've arrived." The bodies of Keldon slain by the rear guard were clearly visible on the sides of the hills. Haddad thought there were less than 10 killed, but it was hard to be sure. The Keldons had been dismembered and scattered by steel ants, and he closed his eyes several times as he tried to get an accurate count. Sergeant Atul motioned the wagons to stay put. He collected an advance party. The column was surrounded by rises just steep enough to block the men's sight and limit mobility. Haddad could see the trail of disturbance the League assault forces left as they scrambled over the loose ground. He could hear what might be combat in the distance. It sounded as if there was fighting over the short rise before them, but noise could carry a long distance, and Sergeant Atul wanted to look before advancing blindly. Everyone climbed very slowly up the slope. The sergeant crouched as he reached the crest, and the others did as well. The scene before them was so unexpected that they looked for several seconds in confusion. Slowly, they began to realize what had happened. The League assault forces, so confidently thrown against the foe, had been defeated. The steel ants, so deadly under Natal's eyes, were scattered pieces, dismembered as crudely and sloppily as the Keldons Haddad had tried to count minutes before. Still stunned, Haddad voiced his first thought. "We'll never fix everything with what we brought." Natal nodded dumbly as Corporal Vanish crabbed quickly over and whispered in Haddad's ear, "Shut your mouth or I'll open your throat." The corporal had a knife in his hand. Haddad realized the stupidity of saying anything aloud. Soldiers picked over the battlefield. Haddad realized he was seeing the enemy for the first time. From this distance, with the sun behind them, it was difficult to make out details. The soldiers seemed very large compared to the League bodies scattered over the field. But perhaps the dead looked smaller when compared to the living? The figures were odd in proportions, and you could hear their voices, deep and guttural, as they turned over and searched the pockets and wallets of the dead. Haddad grasped his launcher more tightly and wished he had the longer-ranged war rocket load instead of Natal's web round. He looked to the sergeant for orders, but Natal stared beyond the debris below and farther on. Haddad followed Atul's gaze and saw the raiders' camp. Even from this distance, he could see League prisoners gathered under Keldon guard. There were huge machines of some type and only a few men with mounts and horses or camels. There were far fewer men than Haddad would have thought possible to overcome the League men and machines. Atul motioned everyone to withdraw. They slid down the slope, each trying to be silent and cringing at the odd word or oxen low from the supply group. The sergeant whispered instructions, even as Corporal Vanish raced back up the line of wagons to start the retreat. "The Keldons must be out here looking for other League forces. They're just too few otherwise." He turned to address Haddad and Natal. "When we withdraw, you two will keep your attention to the rear. Be prepared to sound the alarm, but stay quiet lest you clearly spot the enemy and he spots you. No unnecessary noise." Sergeant Atul gestured emphatically, even as his voice remained at a whisper. But even as he attempted to salvage the situation, a loud cry of alarm sounded up the line. "Raiders, Sergeant!" The corporal was coming back from the rear at a run. Drivers were on the ground, preparing for battle. Sergeant Atul cursed. "Come on, men! We'll see them off!" He grabbed two drivers. "Get water bags and blankets," he whispered. "We'll run if we can." The drivers dived into the rear of the wagons and began slinging out water bottles for after the fight. Haddad and Natal followed Atul as he reached the last wagon. They followed someone who knew what he was doing even as they left one point of the column exposed to attack. The corporal was up in the driver's seat, moving the wagon to the side to start a wall. One other driver was also moving his team, but the Keldons were advancing, a troop on camels closing fast. The attackers seemed giants as they deployed. Each was larger than anyone in Haddad's company, and their heavy armor and decorations made them larger still. At this close range, the Keldons were even more fearsome looking, and their skin was ashen and faded. Each was yelling, and the sound seemed loud enough for thousands instead of the company that Haddad saw. Haddad's heart pounded, and he was short of breath as he neared the back of the column. He wanted to run, and determined not to be a coward, he ran toward the enemy. Each step brought the Keldons closer. Each Keldon shout made him more afraid. The mounted warriors brandished swords and axes, and now their shouts were one voice, battering at his morale and the morale of the supply column. "Shoot when you can!" Atul cried as he grabbed a shield from the back of a wagon. The League soldiers formed into clumps, and swords sprouted like weeds as each man cursed his luck. Natal danced around an ox and looked for a target. His launcher rose to his shoulder, and he fired the war rocket Haddad had given him. It flew in a flat arc and hit the shoulder of a camel. The rocket's charge shattered the animal's side and removed the gray-skinned raider's leg in a bright flash. Haddad could hear the sudden amputee cursing as he and the camel separated, breaking up the Keldon line. As if Natal had ordered it, men with launchers let loose other rockets and darts. The Keldon charge was a mass of screaming animals and men, but the warriors swung wide, up the slopes on either side of the wagons. The deaths disrupted the Keldon battle cries, but every warrior was roaring. The League soldiers sent up a few cries of their own, but fear, rather than rage, sounded from the men around their wagons. Haddad and a few others had not fired, the web rounds being point-blank weapons. The enemy jockeyed for position to sweep down over the League. Many Keldons dismounted and gripped axes and shields. Behind Haddad, on the other side of the wagons, he could hear shouts. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the biggest of the raiders calling and signaling. This Keldon must have been near 7 feet tall, cursing and yelling in a pail of smoke. Haddad barely had time to wonder where the fire was when the split Keldon forces descended upon the column. Haddad spun to the nearest Keldon raider and fired his launcher. The round webbed the rider to his camel. Hadad could hear curses that rose to his shout as the camel went down heavily, whipping the rider into the ground. Gear shot off the body, and the Keldon's helmet skipped down the slope, finally hitting a wagon. The struggling animal and its attached corpse slid down the gentle slope to snare another Keldon mount. The rider of the second animal jumped free in time to avoid being trapped. The now standing Keldon wasted no time. He ran at Hadad, screaming a war cry, a longsword in his left hand. Hadad threw the launcher at the man hard. The raider batted it away but stumbled in mid-charge. Hadad drew his short sword, knowing the warrior would bowl him over. Then Natal stepped forward, and Hadad remembered he wasn't alone in this fight. His friend picked up the shield and tried to push the Keldon away. The barbarian overtopped Natal by at least a foot and was in full armor, spikes and studs of metal. The taller warrior swung his sword up and hammered it down. The blade screamed as it tore through Natal's metal shield and sank deep into his torso. His eyes rolled, blood flowed from his mouth as he tried to speak. The Keldon's blow had been too powerful, and his blade was now stuck inside Hadad's friend. The Keldon swore as he tried to haul his blade free from Natal, his eyes wild and inhuman against the ashy skin. Hadad swung his sword at that face, committing everything to this one strike. His blade rang as it hit an armored shoulder and then skidded under the rim of the man's helmet, sinking into his neck. Even mortally wounded by the blow, the Keldon turned and struck Hadad with a gauntleted fist, the studs tearing a line of agony across the League soldier's scalp right over his eyes. Blood poured down and the pain and shock took him off his feet. Hadad could still hear the cries of other soldiers around him as he worked the blade free of the Keldon's neck and tried vainly to clear his eyes to rejoin the battle. He pushed himself off the bodies of his friend's killer. The shouts of his comrades were falling silent as he struggled to stand. The Keldons held the field and the fighting revolved around one wagon, squatting under the heavy load of the supplies it carried. The oxen lay dead in their traces. Atul's voice was falsetto against the cries of the Keldons as he and the others fought on. Spears licked out from under the wagon as the last League soldiers fought like animals trapped in a den. The Keldons laughed now and threw rocks into the wagon. Another Grey Warrior cut heads from corpses and hurled them at the trapped defenders. Hadad saw it all as if very far away as he picked up a shield and carefully pulled his sword free from a dead Keldon's back. He staggered into a charge at a Keldon who ignored him as unworthy sport. The discharge of the launcher must have been accidental, Hadad later decided, or perhaps Atul had decided better to kill oneself than be dug out like a rat. The charge thumped into the bottom of the overloaded wagon and ignited hidden rockets buried there. Accidentally or on purpose, the blast killed the defenders, and Hadad was knocked spinning as a piece of someone smacked into his shield. The Keldons close to the wagon screamed in rage at their injuries and at being robbed of their victory. Supplies that had been hurled into the air from the blast soon fell, mostly striking the wounded gasping on the ground. Hadad swayed drunkenly, turning to face the largest group of Keldons. He hoped to die fighting, but his eyes wouldn't focus, and he saw only blurs and shadows. A hand swept his helmet off. Then there was only pain and darkness as he fell.